Amen. Thank you, Jesus. All right, well, good evening. Again, I want to welcome everyone to the service, both those that are here as well as those that are streaming with us online. We're glad that you're here with us. All right, we're going to do part 10 of the history of modern Israel. So if you want to go and bring up those slides. If you remember last time that we met on a Friday night, we had just gone through the independence of Israel. They declared themselves a nation. They instantly were attacked by the 5 other countries, and Israel won out of that and gained the independence from that. From there, their population was growing very rapidly. They more than doubled their population in the next several years, and they would continue to grow at that time. But the people around them weren't as happy with the outcomes and everything that was going on. So the armistice agreements was mediated by a guy named Ralph Bunche, and he was successful. He actually won a Nobel Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize, for his involvement in here. And if you remember before, the Arabs they refused to go to the meetings that was before World War II and all. They could not stand the thought of having Israel, so they just wouldn't even show up. And he went one-on-one with each of the delegations and basically said if they walked out, they'd be blamed for the failure or the breakdown of the negotiations after that war for independence. And the Arab leaders, though, they basically were like, all right, we started this war, initiated it, we lost, but we're still demanding the same borders that was presented in the UN partition plan. And that became known as a limited liability war. And that's something that they have done over and over and over again throughout history on this, was basically saying they can be the aggressor, and yet if they lose, they can still keep everything that they had before. And again, the thing, though, is you look at some of the strategic placements of there. Egypt had the Suez Canal, which was a very strategic resource, especially as the oil coming in. Going through the Suez Canal saved 10 days off of most of the shipping times that took from ships to go from either Far East or Middle East through the canal going to Britain and other places. And so that was a significant time savings, as well as the stuff that was being brought in. And so that was one of the things they were trying to do. They weren't successful in that one. And the UN General Assembly then decided they needed to create a Palestine Conciliation Commission. And they put it with the United States, France, and Turkey. All of the Arab countries at the UN voted no on this. But it still was able to pass, and they started that. And now we're going to shift focus somewhat over to Egypt. As I stated before, Egypt itself, they own the Suez Canal, but the commission, the one that ran the canal, did all the administration of it, worked with the ships, was actually a separate company that was owned by British and French shareholders. And so Egypt, because they were still upset at Israel and didn't want to have anything to do with them, they blocked the Straits of Tiran, which is, if you see like almost the V shape in the map, those are both those straits. The one that's on the right goes up to just that very tip of Israel on that side. There's not a lot of room there for major type of things, but it does reach up there. And the one on the left is the one that goes up to where the Suez Canal is at the top that allows the passage. And so because they didn't want to do the stuff at the canal, they basically blocked those Straits of Tiran and would not allow any Israel ship or any ship that was carrying stuff for Israel to go through it. It was directly against the armistice agreements. It was stated in there that they could not restrict Israel shipping, and yet they still block them. The UN Security Council met and made the resolution that said that they cannot do that anymore, and Egypt refused to comply. Then in 1952, there was a coup that happened, and the king was taken out, and Gamal Abdel Nasser took over basically the Egyptian government at that time. And a little later in 1956, he basically nationalized that Suez Canal, the commission part of it, effectively kicking out Britain and France. And of course, Britain and France were not too happy with those events there. But Egypt also, with the new president, he really, if you remember before when the War for Independence, Jordan was trying to be the leader of the Arab League. Egypt did not want the king of Jordan to be seen as the leader. He wanted to be the leader. And so Egypt here is really trying to flex. They're really trying, what they're doing is jockeying for position in the Arab League. They want to be known as the main leader on it. King Abdullah of Jordan, he was assassinated early in the 50s just on the rumor, that he would negotiate with Israel. And so again, he's taking that hard stance against Israel, often and means of trying to be ahead in the Arab League. But he stated, Egypt has decided to dispatch her heroes, the disciples of Pharaoh and the sons of Islam, and they will cleanse the land of Palestine. There will be no peace on Israel's border because we demand vengeance, and vengeance is Israel's death. So very strong words for him to publicly, state on there. And these were people that were called the Fedayeen on that. They were basically Arab terrorists. And it's funny because, of his pushing with Jordan, he actually had many of them, or most of them, based in Jordan. So they would cross over from Jordan into Israel, do their acts of sabotage and murder. And then when Israel retaliated, it would be going back against, where they were hiding back in Jordan. And so, funny how all that works out. He didn't want it, even though he was sponsoring it, training that, getting the people. He didn't want it to come from Egypt. He had it come from Jordan instead. The Israel ambassador to the UN, he went to the UN and basically, when they were questioning why Israel was doing all these retaliations, he stated, during the 6 years during which this belligerency has operated in violation of the armistice agreement, they've incurred 1,843 cases of armed robbery and theft, 1,339 cases of armed clashes with Egyptian armed forces, 435 cases of incursion from Egyptian-controlled territory, 172 cases of sabotage perpetrated by the Egyptian military units and Fedayeen and Israel. And as a result of these actions of Egyptian hostility within Israel, 364 Israelis were wounded and 101 killed. In 1956 alone, as a result of this aspect of Egyptian aggression, 28 Israelis were killed and 127 wounded. So he did that with response to the UN, and yet a lot of the UN were really down on Israel for the retaliations that they had done, and putting it much more on Israel than even on Egypt at that time. Egypt further doubled down. Their foreign minister stated, the Arab people will not be embarrassed to declare, we shall not be satisfied except by the final obliteration of Israel from the map of the Middle East. And again, the president stated, I am not solely fighting against Israel itself. My task is to deliver the Arab world from destruction through Israel's intrigue, which has its roots abroad. Our hatred is very strong. There's no sense in talking about peace with Israel. There's not even the smallest place for negotiations. So you go back and just like, how do you live next to, a country that's bent on your destruction, that's sending, all these things to your border and people, to kill your citizens. So that was a mess. And so Britain, France, and Israel, again, because of Egypt taking over the Suez Canal, went to war against Egypt. And it only lasted 10 days in total. But they attacked and regained control of the canal. Their intent was to remove the president, which they were not successful on that. But they were able to get there very quickly. Their armored corps just wiped through, and most of the forces that were the Egyptian forces protecting it were just instantly routed and went back. And there was a lot of world reaction to this too. The United States was not happy at all with this because they were not consulted or told that this would happen. And so they're like, you can't do this, on your own. And so they sponsored a Security Council resolution calling for immediate Israel withdrawal. But both England and France vetoed it at that time. But that didn't stop a lot of the pressure that was going on there. The British troops actually captured Port Said, which is at the very top. If you look at it, that's right on the Mediterranean Sea. I know I'm pointing to what I'm looking at rather than what you are. The very top, that's the strategic port area where the ships would come in from the Mediterranean side. And then the British government basically had to do a ceasefire. And they got pressure both from Russia and from the United States. Russia basically said that if you continue, we're going to use every weapon of war that we have against you. And everyone knew at the time, the Soviets had also developed an atomic bomb. They were doing the testing and everything on there. So they were being threatened by nuclear weapons. And the United States basically used economic pressure, saying that they would withhold a $1 billion loan from the IMF if they didn't go to a ceasefire. So they only had 10 days basically, and still accomplished much of the objectives that they had there. So Israel was basically forced to retreat from territory that they had taken to. They had taken over the Gaza Strip area at the time, but this was part of that same type of limited liability thing where they're just demanding the same. Even though Israel routed the forces, they're demanding the same borders as what's before, and so Israel had to withdraw from that. What came out though was the United States maintained the freedom of passage in the Straits of Tiran, so they did get back to being able to use the canal for a short while. We'll see in the next one that it got closed again for them, but. And then the terrorist group of the Fedayeen basically had to disband. They couldn't operate anymore from Egypt being that way, but they reformed a little later and is known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And so that was founded directly from a terrorist group, and PLO is still known as the terrorist group. All right, and that is all for part 10. We'll go on to the next one later.